Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today, An Introduction to Resilience for Trauma-Informed Professionals for juvenile and family court judges and their staff. My name is Dr. Keith Cruz, and I am one of the co-directors of the Center for Trauma Recovery and Juvenile Justice, which is hosting this webinar for you all today. In case you're unfamiliar with the CTRJJ, we are a training and technical assistance center that is within the National Child Traumatic Stress Network with funding from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. The purpose of the mission of the CTRJJ is to support a comprehensive framework for developing, adopting, implementing, and sustaining evidence-based and trauma-informed services for youth in or who are at risk for involvement in the juvenile justice system. Well, we know through the CTRJJ that supporting youth also means supporting families. What we also know through the CTRJJ is that supporting youth and families also means supporting juvenile justice and mental health professionals that are also interacting with youth and families and providing those services, which by extension leads us to our webinar content for today. A few housekeeping and reminders before we get started. Throughout the webinar, you will have access to the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom toolbar. Please do feel free during the presentation today. Submit your questions to the presenter using that QA function. And I'll be moderating that throughout the webinar. And then our speaker will attempt to, sort of respond to as many questions as possible as time permits at the end of the presentation. You might have heard that this webinar is being recorded, so all registrants who are in attendance today or who have registered, you will receive a follow-up email notification from the CTRJJ when the webinar recording is available on the CTRJJ YouTube channel. Finally, if it is of interest, we will have some instructions at the end of the webinar today about how to access and download a certificate of attendance. This certificate is for personal use or professional sort of monitoring of your participation in webinars or trainings. It is not eligible for either CE or in our case today, CLE credit, but there will be the option for you to obtain that certificate as well. So with those housekeeping and reminders done, I'd like to introduce to you to our speaker today and really thank Dr. Patricia Carrig for being our presenter today. Dr. Carrig is a professor of clinical psychology at the University of Utah and has been a longtime faculty member and collaborator with the Center for Trauma Recovery and Juvenile Justice. Her research focuses on understanding the developmental processes that link childhood trauma exposure to adolescent youth justice involvement, and also looking at the mechanisms that can support resilience and recovery from trauma as well. Through the CTRJJ, Dr. Carrig has contributed to many, many efforts to develop and disseminate evidence-based trauma-informed practices, and is more recently and is the co-author of the RTIP training curriculum, which is what she will be presenting to you all today, which really seeks to build out and to help provide a mechanism of support for staff to protect them from the effects, of exposure to secondary traumatic stress. And with that, I would like to welcome Dr. Carrig, and thank you all for attending.
Thank you so much, Keith. It's my pleasure to be here today. And we have a blank slide. Here we go. This slide gives you an overview of what we're going to be doing together in the next hour. We're going to talk about how we understand this construct of secondary traumatic stress. And we'll also talk about going beyond a focus on personal self-care to fostering resilience. I'll describe for you the tools that are part of the Resilience for Trauma-Informed Professionals curriculum that I've developed. And along the way, we will do a skill building exercise. But I want to start out today by telling you a story about how I came to be interested in this topic. As part of my work for the Center for Trauma Recovery and Juvenile Justice a few years ago, I was doing a training on trauma awareness for a group of probation officers down in Provo, Utah. And one gentleman who'd been sitting quietly throughout the training at the end raised his hand and said, "You've convinced me it's important for us to know if the youth we work with have experienced trauma, but I don't want to be the one to do that work." And I asked him, "Tell me more what you're thinking." And he said, "Because if a youth told me any of those horrible things had happened to them, I wouldn't know what to say." And I thought to myself, that makes perfect sense. You've been trained as a probation officer. You haven't received training in how to respond in helpful ways when youth disclose trauma. And importantly, you also haven't been trained in how to cope with the difficult thoughts and feelings that can arise in us when we learn about others' traumas. So I thought to myself something more was needed and set myself on a journey of discovery to learn all I could about how we're affected by exposure to others' traumas and what is helpful to us in the aftermath. I found some wonderful resources that I'll share with you today, but also some gaps that I thought needed to be filled. So first, who in the juvenile justice system is exposed to others' traumas? Well, it turns out we all are, from judges and magistrates and court staff to detention and residential staff, juvenile defense attorneys and prosecutors, mental health providers in the justice system, and even researchers who study topics related to juvenile justice and trauma. These different professions are exposed in different ways, but common themes that I've heard in the listening sessions that I've been conducting recently include reading trauma-filled case histories, doing trauma history screenings, hearing trauma disclosures, viewing graphic evidence, interacting with distressed youth and family members, and listening to our colleagues talk about their cases. And especially for those who work in facilities or go into the homes of traumatized youth, it's not just a matter of hearing stories about things that happened in the past, but sometimes immediate sensory inputs, sounds and smells and sights that tell us in a very visceral way that something bad has happened here. So why should we be concerned about exposure to others' traumas? It turns out that exposure to others' traumas has a real impact. As Tim Wires put it, you don't have to be shot to go through a shooting. And in fact, exposure to others' traumas is a potential source of trauma for us. What I think is interesting to know is that this wasn't always understood to be the case. The long-standing definition of trauma in the diagnostic manual that defines PTSD includes exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence through directly experiencing it ourselves, witnessing it happen to somebody else, or learning about it happening to a loved one. And this we can term primary trauma exposure. But for the first time, when the diagnostic manual was revised in 2013, added to it was repeated or extreme exposure to the aversive details of somebody else's traumatic event. And the definition goes on to give the example of officers who are repeatedly exposed to the details of child abuse. So this we can term secondary traumatic stress exposure and the aftermath secondary traumatic stress. So if this is true, then addressing STS is not just a matter of our own personal self-care when we go home at the end of the day. Rather, it's a professional competency that's needed for those whose work involves traumatized people or exposure to trauma-related material. So the skills for recognizing, preventing, and responding to secondary traumatic stress are tools that we need in our professional toolkits. So it's important to say, even though I'm talking about the definition of trauma in the context of diagnosis, having a reaction to others' traumas is not a sign of psychopathology. It's only human. So post-traumatic stress and secondary traumatic stress come into play when those reactions cause us significant distress and interfere with our ability to function. Because, as Rachel Raymond puts it, to expect that we can be exposed to trauma-related information every day in our work lives without being affected is as unrealistic as expecting to be able to wade through water without getting wet. Before I go on, I want to talk about the different terms that get used around this. And one of them is burnout. And burnout refers to feelings of emotional exhaustion and ineffectiveness that can come about when we're doing work in which we feel powerless and unappreciated. And certainly burnout can occur in the context of secondary trauma exposure. But what's important to know about burnout is it's not specific to trauma. The person who flips burgers at Burger King can experience burnout if they feel powerless and unappreciated. Another term that's used is compassion fatigue. And this is used to refer to that feeling of being emotionally spent by caring for others without being able to replenish our own reserves. We've gone to the well once too often and the well is dry. But this is a problematic term, and I want to explain why I'm saying that. There is a really lovely animated film that Brene Brown created to illustrate the difference between empathy and sympathy. And in this film, the little red fox is in despair and has gone down into the well of despair. Other animals come by and offer sympathy. Hey, looks like you're having a rough day. Hope you cheer up soon. But the empathetic bear comes down into the well and shares the fox's feeling state. The fox appreciates this. The fox no longer feels so alone and feels understood. But if you look at this image, you see black clouds of despair over both of their heads. And I wonder what's going to happen to this poor bear. So if empathy refers to sharing another person's feeling state, compassion is something different. Compassion means recognizing that another person is in distress or in need of assistance and throwing a lifeline down to them and helping them. So rather than going down into the well of despair, we help that person to leave that situation. And when we're doing this in the context of a mutually supportive social ecology, we're not having to do it alone. We've all got one another's backs. So with that in mind, I think compassion fatigue is a misnomer, and a better term for this phenomenon is empathy fatigue, because it's the empathy that is draining. Yet another term that gets used is vicarious trauma. And this captures really well the change in our own experience that can come about when we have repeated exposures to traumatized persons with whom we empathize. And one of the reasons why I think this is a really helpful concept to know about is it's related to another one that has been receiving a lot of attention, and that is moral injury. According to Britt Litz and his colleagues, moral injury can be defined as perpetrating, failing to prevent, bearing witness to, or learning about acts that violate our own deeply held moral beliefs and expectations. This was a construct that was first identified in military personnel who were coming back from service, having done or witnessed things that they felt deeply to be wrong. But since then, it's been expanded to many different populations, including in my lab, youth in the juvenile justice system. They have no difficulty understanding this concept and identifying ways in which it's relevant to them, whether they have elected to do something that they feel is wrong, been pressured to do something, failed to act when they could have done the right thing, witnessing injurious actions, or what we have found to be the most impactful dimension of moral injury, betrayal, when somebody they should have been able to turn to for protection and care has done something that they feel is deeply wrong. So then the last term, the term that I've been using, is secondary traumatic stress. And in the formal definition of the term, that would include the presence of any of the symptoms that are related to PTSD in the aftermath of exposure to someone else's trauma, whether those are intrusive, unwelcome thoughts, efforts to avoid anything that's reminiscent of the trauma, feelings of being keyed up and fidgety, and changes in our own thoughts and moods. And because I think of secondary traumatic stress as being at the extreme end of the continuum and including dimensions of the other constructs, it's the term that I have been using. The other reason why it's helpful to consider these different constructs is there can also be the opposite. So, just as though there can be so called compassion fatigue or empathy fatigue, we can also experience compassion satisfaction when we feel competent at our work, when we know we're making a contribution, and we have positive relationships with our colleagues. And just as there can be vicarious trauma, there also can be vicarious resilience, the uplift that we experience when we witness another person's recovery from trauma. We also know from research a little bit about the risk and protective factors for having secondary traumatic stress reactions. An important one is an isolative work environment, whereas having connection with our colleagues is protective. The sheer volume of trauma exposure increases the risk, whereas support and helpful debriefing, which we'll talk about a bit later, can mitigate the risk. Some research suggests that people with high levels of empathy are more vulnerable, whereas compassion satisfaction has been shown to be protective. An important one is feelings of shame about having STS reactions. People can be very hard on themselves. I'm supposed to be professional. I'm not supposed to be affected by this. Whereas openness and acknowledgement that this is an occupational hazard can be helpful. Research also shows that people who come into this work with their own history of exposures to trauma and adversity may be more vulnerable, but that isn't an absolute. Having achieved resolution and made meaning of those experiences can erase that link. And then finally, the last thing on this table is something that we don't yet have empirical research for, but it's my hypothesis and my observation that the fact that people are going in to these situations feeling unprepared, like that probation officer, I wouldn't know what to say. That in itself seems to me to increase vulnerability to STS. Whereas the simple knowledge that we have the tools in our toolkit to face whatever we encounter is protective. So, what does secondary traumatic stress look like? Well, it depends on who you ask. But one of the resources I found in my search is a wonderful book by Laura Vandernoot-Lipsky entitled Trauma Stewardship. And that title comes from her main argument that if we are going to work with people who've experienced trauma, we need to not only be good stewards or caretakers of them, we also need to be good stewards or caretakers of ourselves and our capacity to be helpful. One of the things I love about her book is her use of humor. She got permission to use a number of cartoons, particularly from the New Yorker magazine, and so I got permission to use those as well. So let's take a look at what STS might look like. One form that can take is feelings of helplessness and low self-efficacy. And although I think this is a funny cartoon, I'm going to take exception to it a little bit later in this presentation. Another is that feeling of working as hard as we can, but we're never doing enough. We're just howling at the moon. Another is that feeling of hypervigilance, of being always on, never being able to take a break away, barking at everything. Another is loss of a sense of pleasure in life. A big one that I see is cynicism. When people discover that they have lost their sense of meaning and optimism and purpose in the work they do. And the opposite can also be true, that for some people it takes the form of feeling trapped by their own indispensability, that they're the only ones who can put out this forest fire. So one of the reasons why I appreciate the humor in this is that it is a way of helping us to talk about real experiences that are challenging. So in her book, Vandernoot-Lipsky also includes quotes from real people who are experiencing these forms of STS. So here an animal rescue worker talks about, no matter how many I save, all I can think about is the ones I have failed to save, and that feels like a personal failure. And here, a community organizer talks about just getting through the day, going to work, coming home, and going round and round the dial. And here, a domestic violence advocate talks about not even being able to take pleasure looking at a friend's wedding photos without the intrusive thought coming into her mind of, I wonder when the domestic violence is going to start. And here, an attorney for death row inmates says that feeling I can never do enough is not just a feeling, it's true. If I don't do my job right, someone's life could be lost. So signs of STS may be behavioral, increased substance use or other kinds of addictive behaviors, including workaholism, increased anger or irritability, socially isolating ourselves, and what Francoise Mathieu calls the silencing response, shutting other people down, letting them know I'm full up to here and you can't ask any more of me. The signs may be psychological, including emotional exhaustion, negative mood, reduced empathy and cynicism, a changed worldview when moral injury comes into play, any of the signs associated with post-traumatic stress. And here again, we see some individual differences, that some people report becoming overly sensitive. They can't tolerate watching movies or television shows that are reminiscent of the traumas they're exposed to. And others report the opposite, that they feel numb and actually crave that kind of exposure. The signs may come into play in our professional lives, that overburdened sense of responsibility and being on, or the opposite, avoiding work, resenting the demands, dreading the workday, and difficulty separating our work and personal life. And although I'm talking about these as being separate domains, of course, they tend to co-occur and interact with one another. So I'd mentioned this idea of the listening sessions that I've been doing, and I have been asking individuals who play different roles in the juvenile justice system, how do people in your world encounter secondary traumatic stress, and how do you see it affecting yourself and others? When it comes to judges, though, there's some very powerful quotes that I want to provide from a study that was done by Ginny Sprang and her colleagues. They did interviews with 82 juvenile and family court judges who were focused on cases involving sex trafficking of minors. Over 80% reported being distressed by their work. They described nightmares, intrusive thoughts that kept them awake, negative mood, anger, and helplessness, worrying about these things happening to their own children or grandchildren, feeling physically ill. As one put it, my guess is it brings up emotions for 10 out of 10 of us. Being on the bench is like getting shot with an AK-47 for 6 hours. You want to help, but you feel like you can't. Some have talked about the experience of STS being invisible to them until long after the exposure. There's a wonderful article a retired Judge Karen Adam wrote about the price she paid for being a good judge. She did not recognize that she'd been affected by STS until she was retired and called to jury duty, where exposure to the material related to this crime brought up for her a very strong reaction she had been suppressing for years. In this quote, she says, "What's not so obvious is that a judge needs to sit there and hear terrible things without responding, which is not naturally human. A judge needs to remain dignified, calm, respectful, and emotions must be buried. But suppressing emotions for days or months or years carries a heavy toll. A kind of numbness can develop. Sleeping and eating suffer. Some develop substance abuse, addictive exercise regimes." She says, "By the time I left the bench, I rarely cried or was visibly upset by anything that happened in my personal life." So very powerful. Is this news? Does nobody know about this? In fact, when I went to the literature, I found quite a few studies that have documented the impact of secondary traumatic stress on judges. And there is an even wider literature on other professionals in the justice system. What I also found striking is that recently a court system in Australia was found liable for failing to protect judicial officers from the harms of vicarious trauma exposure. The court determined that any employer, even a court system, has a duty of care when exposure to trauma is inherent in an employee's work. So clearly, this is something that deserves our attention. And what do we find when we go to the literature about what is recommended to help people to recover from the aftermath of secondary traumatic stress? What we find almost universally is the recommendation to engage in self-care. So you can see here a veritable sea of self-care. There are also some measures that we can use to gauge whether we are using good self-care activities such as taking time off, doing things that are relaxing, eating well, getting physical exercise, maintaining our connections with our social contacts and our spirituality. And those are undoubtedly good things to do that would be helpful for all of us. But there's some reason to think that there are limitations to self-care as an antidote to secondary traumatic stress exposure. For one thing, what happens when busy and stressed people go home at the end of the day? We don't always engage in the strategies that are going to be, excuse me, most helpful for us in the long run. But more than that, there's some research that suggests that self-care has limits. For example, one study of trauma professionals found that participating in trainings that encourage self-care didn't actually increase the amount of time people spent in self-care activities. That's perhaps not surprising. We don't always do the things we know will be good for us. But what was more surprising is the amount of time people spent in self-care was not associated with lower secondary traumatic stress. Well, why might this be the case? One possibility is that most suggested self-care activities take place when we go home at the end of the day. So that's long after secondary trauma exposure and is divorced from the workplace. Instead, maybe what we need are strategies that we can use in the moment, in the here and now, even proactive strategies before exposures that will be protective, and also things that we can do that are integrated with our workplace environments. Another potential limit of self-care is that there is not always attention paid to individual differences and how culture impacts the beliefs people have about what is disrupted when we encounter trauma, how we understand it, the coping strategies and social resources that we have at hand. And importantly, our cultural beliefs can impact the beliefs we have about what will lead to healing. And the activities that are on self-care lists may not necessarily be those that are most culturally relevant and regenerative for people from different backgrounds. So if we turn away from self-care and look for an alternative, one that I think is worth considering is the concept of resilience. But what is resilience? When researchers first started studying resilience, they talked about it as though there were some people who were just armor plated. They were impervious. They could walk through fire without getting burned. But as the research continued, we came to see that that is not a good depiction of resilience. People who are resilient are affected by their experiences. And that's just as well, because wearing a suit of armor would be hot and heavy and uncomfortable. I also don't think resilience is well captured by the idea of wearing a psychological hazmat suit that insulates us from the toxins around us. Because in fact, having emotions related to our work is only human, but also our emotions are a valuable tool. They tell us when there's something we need to pay attention to. So instead, I think of resilience as successfully adapting in the face of challenges, but by knowing that we are going to be affected by our experiences. It's also not an all or nothing phenomenon. We can be resilient in some ways, even if we're struggling in others. And it's not just a matter of our own true grit. Resilience isn't a personality trait, although there may be traits that contribute to it. Rather, it's made up of strengths and protective factors in multiple domains. So as John Gritch and Sherry Hamby and their colleagues presented, resilience has an emotional dimension, our capacity to be aware of our emotions and to cope with them with honesty and humility. It has a cognitive or meaning making component, our ability to maintain our sense of purpose and stay connected with our beliefs, and also an interpersonal dimension, our ability to be generative toward others, to be compassionate toward others, as well as ourselves, and to maintain our sense of social support and community. So, what would enable us to be resilient in the aftermath of exposure to secondary traumatic stress? What I would argue is just like exposure to primary trauma, secondary traumatic stress dysregulates us physically, emotionally, cognitively, even morally, and causes us to experience as though it's happening in the present, something that's happened in the past. So if that's true, the strategies that will protect us will be those that reestablish our balance, ground us in the present, help to dispel unhelpful interpretations, and reconnect us to our strengths, sources of support, and values. So with that resilience framework in mind, I developed Resilience for Trauma-Informed Professionals. And there's an article in which I talk about the conceptual underpinnings. But I thought what would be most helpful today is to introduce you to RTIP in terms of the different tools involved at each stage of our encounter with secondary traumatic stress. And I'll go through each of these in more detail, but essentially that means paying attention to ways that we might be preventative, things that we can do to armor ourselves before exposure. And then what I found most missing in the materials that I found already existing, what can we do in the moment while we're encountering secondary traumatic stress? And then, of course, what can we do in the aftermath to recover? So if we talk first about, and all of the examples I'm going to show you come from the workbook that I created that accompanies the training in RTIP. So if we start with a prevention point of view, one of the things that we might consider is that secondary traumatic stress can be contagious. One of the most helpful things that we can do if we're struggling with something that we have encountered is to seek support and debriefing from others. But we have to consider the possibility that we may be passing it on. So, are there ways that we can get support from others without necessarily sharing every graphic detail? And can we, if we're on the receiving end of a debrief, gently steer others from providing too much information? And here we talk about a technique called limited impact debriefing that requires us to think about what it is that we need to share, to give fair warning if the content is going to be extremely distressing, and to pause and give the other person the opportunity to consent. Yes, this is a good time for me, or actually, no, I'm struggling with something myself. We also talk about even if we are on the receiving end of a debrief, what might keep us stuck in a trauma story? And here we talk about the importance of appraisals, also called beliefs, cognitions, interpretations, judgments, or schemas. Our interpretations are important because they can impact our emotions, our behavior, and how we interact with others. They can be helpful and lead to resilience or unhelpful and increase the likelihood of secondary traumatic stress reactions. And importantly, they're open to change. So then what about in the moment when we're being exposed to secondary traumatic stress? What tools can we have in our toolbox? One was inspired by that probation officer who said, I wouldn't know what to say. Well, what do you say? What would be helpful to say in response to a youth who is disclosing trauma, and what might not be helpful to say? So there is a worksheet on that. We also talk about what for many people is a worst case scenario, is scary about the thought of working with those who've been traumatized. What if somebody has a post-traumatic reaction right there and then with me in the room? So we talk about it. How would you respond? What would be helpful to do and say? And throughout, we're paying attention to individual differences, that what works for one person is not necessarily going to work for another. So rather than being prescriptive, everyone should use this type of mindfulness or meditative exercise. We set ourselves all on a journey of discovery to learn about what works for us. Then in the aftermath of trauma exposure, what helps us to restore our balance. And here, one tool that is readily available is the Professional Quality of Life Scale. It is online and you can go there for free. Fill it out and it gives you an instant readout on your level of burnout, your level of secondary traumatic stress, and on the positive side, your level of compassion satisfaction. But one limitation to the ProQuil is that the signs of secondary traumatic stress it lists may not necessarily be yours. So an alternative that I want to introduce you to is called a dosimeter. And this term comes from the little badge that an X-ray technician wears that tells them if they have been exposed to a toxic level of X-ray. If we had such a badge that we could wear for STS exposure, that would be very helpful. But since that doesn't exist, we can create our own. And what this requires is sitting down and thinking, what am I like when I'm in my green zone, when I'm at my best, when I'm not stressed, and when I'm thinking calmly and clearly? And then what am I like when I'm in my yellow zone, when I'm beginning to show the signs of being affected by the work I do? And then what am I like in my red zone when secondary traumatic stress may have taken over and is affecting me very deeply? And of course, as you might think, recognizing your yellow zone signs is so valuable because the strategies that you use to recover your balance will be more effective when you're in your yellow zone than when things have spilled over into the red. So as we're doing the dosimeter, it's helpful to think about what are the signs that you show most when you're at work, and then what are the signs that you show when you come home, because that may be very different. Often people say, honestly, I'm a consummate professional. Nobody would know that I'm being affected by my work. But when I go home and let my hair down, then the cracks begin to show. The other thing I invite people to do as they're completing the dosimeter is to think about who is the best source of information to complete this. Often our thought is, well, me, because I know myself best. But sometimes that might not be true. Sometimes there is somebody around you who knows you well and picks up on things that you yourself aren't aware of. For example, I had a colleague who told me, I can always tell when your work is getting the best of you. And I asked, really? How? And she said, because you lose your sense of humor. You don't laugh at my jokes anymore. And I had just thought sometimes she wasn't funny. I hadn't realized that that was a cue that I was being negatively affected by my work. So we can engage others to help us to be aware of those signs. If there are people in your world that you feel comfortable with and trust, you can even make them accountability buddies to monitor your dosage and to give you a nudge if it is time for you to engage one of your tools. So the dosimeter is part of a larger toolkit in RTIP that encourages us to know our warning signs, to engage in regular self-checks about our well-being, and to have in our toolbox strategies that we have tried out and found to be effective for helping us to prepare in advance when we know that we're going to be exposed to someone else's trauma. During exposure, ways that we can be calming and centering and regulating ourselves, restorative and self-regulation strategies that we'll actually use when we're at work, in the transition between home and work, and when we're at home. And then in the longer term, what are the things that help us to be resilient, recharge our batteries rather than just unplugging at the end of the day, staying physically and emotionally healthy, and nurturing our compassion satisfaction. We also talk about what is going to get in the way of using the tools in the toolbox. One is thinking that these resilience promoting activities are self-indulgent or even selfish. But it's important to remember that we'll do our best work and be able to help others most when we ourselves are clear thinking, calm, and healthy. As Sakna put it really powerfully, we have an obligation to our clients as well as to ourselves, our colleagues, and our loved ones not to be damaged by the work we do. And as Robin Tenner put it more concisely, STS hurts you and hurts your family. Other things that can get in the way is waiting too long to use the tools in our toolbox. We're in the red zone rather than the yellow zone. And then not practicing what we preach. Attending trainings like this and then not using the skills that we have learned is, as Francoise Mathieu put it, just reading about these strategies without using them is like trying to fix a flat tire by reading your car's owner's manual. The other thing that's important to keep in mind is, although self-care tends to be focused on things for us to do as individuals, if we're going to address secondary traumatic stress, it needs to be a multi-pronged effort. Yes, there are professional skills that individuals can develop, and there is a role that one's own personal commitment and investment come into play. But an important piece of the puzzle are the organizational supports that can help to assess the well-being of individuals in an organization, prevent preventable exposures, promote resilience, and create that social ecology of mutual care. So here we are in that second stage of RTIP, where prior to proposed exposure, we want to build resilience and protective factors. So I think of organizational strategies coming in three ways. The first is prevention wherever possible. The second is monitoring acknowledging that STS is an occupational hazard and paying attention to signs that staff are being affected. And then third, responding to those who have been affected through providing supervision that's informed by an understanding of STS and non-pathologizing ways of accessing supports and referrals, including referrals for individual therapy. Because despite how funny this cartoon is, seeking therapy is an act of high self-efficacy. So to give you an example of this, one of the things, the tools in RTIP that was inspired by participants in early trainings I did is designed for those who must view graphic material. The first time this was brought to me was an attorney who talked about the impact of having to look at videos or images over and over while preparing a court case. So we developed tools for RTIP that are designed for two levels. The first is designed for organizations, for those who are supervising and training and responsible for monitoring the well-being of staff. What can they do to acknowledge that this is difficult material to look at, to protect and prepare and monitor and respond to staff who are doing this work? And then the second tool is for individuals themselves, how they can be prepared, monitor their reactions, and recover from exposure to what are sometimes very difficult images and material. Excuse me. So on these next slides, I've shared with you some of the resources that I found really useful. There's a working group of the National Child Traumatic Stress Network that's created a number of terrific resources on how organizations and systems can be more STS informed, and how supervisors, not just clinical supervisors, but supervisors in all contexts, can support their staff who are exposed to secondary traumatic stress. Here are also some resources that I particularly found useful on resilience and recovery in the aftermath of STS, and some resources that are specific to justice-related organizations. All right, with that, I will hand it back over to Keith.
Excellent. Thank you, Patricia. And I think what we want to do is to sort of take a moment here. And what you see up on the screen right now is just a QR code. If you would like to connect with the CTRJJ for any resources any of our resources here. But I'd also, of course, like to thank Patricia for her wonderful comments today, and to open this up for any questions that any of the attendees might have. You can, of course, feel free to put those in the Q&A or in the chat as well. And to kind of get us kicked off here, so I'll be looking to see if there are any questions. But Patricia, in listening to your presentation today, I was really curious on the Sprang study that you mentioned, which was with judges. Really interesting, but also alarming. And I'm curious if you had any thoughts, if the fact that these judges were dealing with it sounds like maybe a very focal, maybe court concern around commercial sexual exploitation or trafficking. If you think that that might have tailored the results a little bit, or do you think the results would look much different for a judge or a court administrator that is dealing more with a more open or varied docket, whether it be child welfare or juvenile justice?
Oh, that's a really interesting question, Keith. There are other studies in other contexts that have documented very high levels of secondary traumatic stress amongst judges, not specific to that context. Um, but my subjective sense is that there are things that involve moral injury even more poignantly than others. And I think horrific abuse of children is something that is highly morally injurious.
Yes.
And this is something I haven't seen research on this, but it's a hypothesis that I think is worth testing. We have found in other contexts with justice-involved youth that um, standard kinds of trauma exposures, of course, are associated with negative effects. But those effects are magnified significantly by the presence of moral injury. And so I would hypothesize that the same would be true of judges, that they will be affected by hearing, terrible, upsetting things and being exposed to evidence involving crimes. But if those crimes contain an element that is deeply morally injurious, I think the impact is going to be even heightened.
Yeah, and I think that that makes a lot of sense, particularly from the other quote from the judge that mentioned, the impact after trying to leave from being off the bench of probably working on containment, if you will, and then being overwhelmed by that. I guess another question that occurred to me during your presentation is we often talk to the CTRJJ about judges being conveners, right? Et cetera. And I think that's very true. But I was reflecting during your presentation of how difficult or challenging it may be for judges who are presiding on the bench and then maybe experiencing not only youth or families or other court personnel who may be experiencing STS, and how challenging that this may be for this role in particular, whether that be managing the courtroom, um, or being aware of staff reactions or other partners, from the attorneys, et cetera, that may be in the courtroom. Um, just, I know that's really not much of a question, if you will, but I wonder if you have any reflections on that more for what judges, any suggestions for judges as, conveners, if you will, or the fact that they are operating and trying to manage all these dynamics in the courtroom itself.
That's really a very good point. And I have heard from judges in the listening sessions that I have done about the weight of them feeling ultimately responsible for everything that happens in their courtroom and the well-being of all the individuals in it. And that is a very heavy responsibility. I think what is so important is to have sources of support. The cost for judges that I have heard is feelings of isolation. No one else can understand this. It's important that I not show feelings of vulnerability and being affected. So I have found that it has been so valuable for judges to have sources of peer support, to be able to acknowledge these things in settings where they're talking to other judges. And the other thing is it needs to go beyond the individual judge and their courtroom, that what I really want to see is system change. So that the occupational hazard we're all exposed to is recognized as such, and we're all working together to try and mitigate those risks.
That's excellent. Yeah. Thank you so much, Patricia, and for that reflection as well. And as a reminder, if any individuals on the webinar would like access to the certificate for participation, here is the instructions for how you can access that certificate or download. We encourage you to take your phone and to take a quick snapshot of this so you can retain the instructions before our webinar ends. Once again, this recording will also be made available on the CTRJJ YouTube channel, and all of our registrants will receive an email notification for when that occurs. Patricia, on behalf of the CTRJJ, let me just thank you for the number of times you've delivered this webinar to different roles. And so this concludes our webinar series for RTIP. And thank you so much for your attendance today.